You have been sorry for so long. Sorry for needing too much. Sorry for feeling too deeply. Sorry for taking up space in rooms that were always supposed to be yours. And somewhere along the way, you stopped noticing that you were doing it, the shrinking, the softening, the making yourself smaller so that others could feel larger. This audiobook was written for the moment you finally ask, what if I was never the problem? In today's audiobook, we explore the quiet devastation of self-erasure, the heart of stop apologizing for existing, healing the wounds that made you shrink, published by Unchained Heart. In these pages, we go beyond the surface, inviting you to sit with what this theme truly means in your own life, not as a diagnosis, not as a label to carry, but as a territory of lived experience that deserves, finally, to be understood. Because this is not a story about weakness. This is a story about what happens to a person, often a deeply sensitive, deeply intelligent person, when the world around her teaches her, early and repeatedly, that the safest way to exist is to exist less. To speak more quietly, to need less openly, to fill no more than the narrowest allowance of space. This is a story about what that teaching does to a life over time. And more than anything, this is a story about what becomes possible when a woman begins, gently and without fanfare, to question everything she was taught about how much of herself she is allowed to be. You may have come here after a relationship that left you smaller than you arrived. You may have come here after years of noticing that you apologize for things that require no apology, for your opinion, for your presence, for the simple fact of having a need. You may have come here in the quiet after everyone else is asleep, with a feeling that is hard to name but impossible to ignore, a sense that something important was taken from you. Or perhaps that you gave it away so gradually you never noticed it was gone. Whatever brought you here, I want you to know this. You are not here by accident. Something in you already knows that this is the conversation you have needed to have for a very long time. In the pages ahead, we will move through 6 chapters that trace the full arc of self-erasure, from its roots to its unraveling. In the first chapter, we will return to where this began, to the original soil where the habit of making yourself small first took hold. We will look honestly at the early experiences that taught you that your fullness was too much, and we will begin to understand them not as truths about who you are, but as adaptations that once kept you safe. In the second chapter, we will explore how those early lessons quietly built an identity, a version of yourself constructed around the belief that smallness is virtue, that selflessness is love, that the woman who needs nothing is the woman most worthy of staying. In the third chapter, we will look at the relationship patterns this identity created, the dynamics you found yourself inside, often without fully understanding how you got there, and why certain people and certain situations seem to find you with uncanny precision. In the fourth chapter, we will sit with what the body has been holding all this time, because the body keeps its own account of every moment you were asked to be less than you were, and it has been waiting patiently for permission to speak. In the fifth chapter, we will mark the beginning of the unchaining, not as a dramatic rupture, but as a series of almost imperceptible shifts. The first time you do not apologize, the first time you do not explain, the first time you allow yourself to take up the space that was always, quietly, yours. And in the sixth chapter, we will rest inside a vision of what life feels like when the long habit of shrinking finally begins to loosen, not perfection, not arrival, but a new and honest quality of presence that changes everything it touches. Let us begin gently, at the root of this. Before we do, if these words are already finding something true in you, I want to warmly invite you to follow the Unchained Heart channel. Every week, we release new audiobooks that live in this same healing territory, written for the woman who is quietly, privately, finding her way back to herself. Follow now, so that the next one finds you when you need it. Chapter 1. The Soil Where Smallness Was Planted. There is a particular kind of learning that happens before we have language for it. Before we can name what is occurring, before we can stand outside the experience and observe it with any distance, we are already absorbing it into the deepest layers of who we believe ourselves to be. This is the learning that happens in childhood. Not in classrooms, not in textbooks. In the quality of a parent's gaze when we were too loud, in the way a room went quiet when we cried, in the precise and consistent message delivered across thousands of small moments, that some parts of us were welcome and other parts were not. Not every childhood that plants the seed of self-erasure looks the same. Some were homes where a parent's emotional volatility meant that the safest strategy was to become invisible, to take up no space, to create no friction, to be the child who needed nothing and therefore endangered nothing. In those homes, a young girl learned that her needs were a burden, that her feelings were a disruption, that the most loving thing she could do was to shrink the surface area of her presence until the storm passed. Other homes were quieter, but the message was no less present. The home where love was conditional on performance, where she was cherished when she was agreeable, when she was helpful, when she caused no trouble, and where something subtly withdrew when she expressed disagreement or desire. In those homes, the lesson was gentler but no less thorough. Love is not unconditional. Love is a contract, and the terms of the contract required a version of herself that was always slightly less than the whole. Some of us learned it not from one defining parent, but from a culture, a community, a religion, a social world that consistently returned one message when girls tested the boundaries of their fullness. That was too much. You were too much. Scale it back, soften it, apologize for it. Be smaller, and you will be safer, and you will be loved. The profound cruelty of this early education is that it works. The child who learns to be small is, in many of the environments that taught her, genuinely safer, genuinely more loved in the conditional way those environments could offer love. The adaptation is not pathology, it is intelligence. It is the young self reading the room with exquisite precision and adjusting accordingly. She is not broken. She is ingeniously, heartbreakingly responsive to the world she was given. But here is what that intelligence could not anticipate. The world would change, and the adaptation would not. She would grow up. She would leave the rooms that required her smallness, and she would carry the habit with her into every room she entered afterward, because by then it was not a strategy she chose. It was the shape of her. It was what she believed, in the quietest and most foundational part of herself, that she was allowed to be. This is where we begin, not with blame, not with a verdict on the people or systems that taught her this, but with a clear and compassionate seeing of the original soil. Because you cannot tend a garden without first understanding what was planted there, and under what conditions, and by whose hand. This brings us gently to what that original planting built over time. Chapter 2. The identity that grew in the shade there is a difference between a behavior and an identity. A behavior is something you do. An identity is something you are or believe yourself to be. And the movement from one to the other happens so slowly, so organically, so far below the level of conscious decision that most people never notice it happening at all. The child who learned to be small did not decide to make smallness her identity. She simply practiced it every day in response to the world around her. And practice, as all of us know, eventually becomes nature. What we do long enough, we become. Or at the very least, we become convinced that we have become it, which, for the purposes of how we move through the world, amounts to the same thing. By the time she is a grown woman, she does not experience her tendency to apologize, to defer, to silence her own wants before they become inconvenient, as a strategy she is employing. She experiences it as who she is. She would describe herself, if asked, as someone who is easygoing, someone who doesn't like conflict, someone who genuinely just wants everyone to be comfortable. And all of that may be true. But underneath it, wound into the very fiber of that self-description, is something she has never quite looked at directly. The deep and quiet belief that her full self, the one with opinions and preferences and needs and edges, is too much for the world to welcome. This belief becomes a kind of architecture. It organizes everything. It decides how she speaks in meetings, carefully, always checking the room before she commits to a position. It decides how she moves through friendships, always the available one, the listener, the one who asks more questions than she answers. It decides how she handles conflict, which is to say, how she avoids it, absorbs it, apologizes for it even when it was not hers to own. It decides how she occupies physical space, the way she makes herself narrow in a full elevator, the way she apologizes when someone else walks into her. There is a kind of grief in sitting with this, in recognizing not just the behavior, but the belief system beneath it. The entire internal world that was built on the premise that less of her was more lovable than all of her. Because this is not a small thing. This is a life shaped around a fundamental misunderstanding of her own worth. And she has been living inside that misunderstanding for so long that it has come to feel indistinguishable from reality. What deserves particular tenderness here is this. The woman who built this identity was not passive. She was not simply a victim of what happened to her. She was actively, creatively, intelligently constructing a way of being that allowed her to survive the environment she was given. The self-erasure was, in its original form, an act of profound resourcefulness. It was her way of staying in the rooms where she needed to stay, of maintaining the connections that kept her safe, of navigating a world that consistently communicated that her fullness was unwelcome. To look at that with honesty, to see both what it cost and what it once provided, is not self-pity. It is the first real act of self-understanding. And self-understanding, it turns out, is the very beginning of everything. Let us now sit with what this identity created in the intimate landscape of her relationships. Chapter 3. The patterns that found her. There is something that those who work closely with emotional healing return to again and again, that we do not choose our patterns consciously. We move toward what is familiar. Familiarity does not mean comfortable. It does not mean healthy. It means recognized. It means the feeling, however painful, of being on known ground. The woman who learned early that love required her to be small will move through her adult relationships with an internal template that she cannot see, because she has never stood outside it. She will find herself, with a consistency that can feel almost supernatural, in dynamics where her smallness is required again, where her needs are the ones that get quietly shelved, where her feelings are the ones that require management or apology, where she is perpetually making more room than she is given. This does not happen because she is drawn to suffering. It happens because the dynamic is legible to her. She knows how to be in it. She knows her role. And somewhere beneath the difficulty of the relationship, there is the deep comfort of the familiar, of being in a story whose contours she already knows, even if she does not enjoy the ending. Consider the relationship where she does all the emotional labor, where she tracks his feelings, anticipates his moods, structures her own emotional expression around his capacity to receive it, where she learns very quickly which version of herself he can accommodate and which version of herself she needs to keep carefully out of sight. She adapts, she contracts. She becomes, over time, a curated selection of herself, the parts he approves of, assembled in the order that keeps the peace. Or consider the friendship where she is always the one who asks, "How are you?" Where the calls are structured around the other person's life, the other person's struggles, the other person's triumphs and fears, where she leaves every conversation having given something and received very little, and where she has learned not to examine this too closely because the examination would require her to want something, and wanting something would risk the friendship, and the friendship, even in this uneven form, feels better than the alternative. These are not anomalies. These are patterns, and patterns have origins. The dynamic she finds herself inside as a grown woman echoes, with remarkable fidelity, the dynamic she navigated as a child. The emotional unavailability that requires her to manage rather than be met. The conditional warmth that she earns by making herself convenient. The subtle but consistent message that her fullness is an imposition. Here is what is important to hold alongside this. Recognizing the pattern is not the same as blaming herself for it. The woman who finds herself here did not create these dynamics out of carelessness. She created them out of the only blueprint she had. Understanding the blueprint is not a verdict. It is, finally, a map, and a map is the first requirement for finding a way out. This brings us to a territory that is rarely spoken about directly, but that deserves its own space entirely. Chapter 4. What the body has been holding, the body does not forget. This is one of the things that those who work closely with the long aftermath of emotional wounding consistently observe. That what the mind learns to manage, what the heart learns to narrativize, what the intellect learns to explain, the body holds in a different register entirely. Not in language, not in story. In sensation, in tension, in the particular way a chest closes when a certain tone of voice enters the room. The woman who has spent years making herself small has a body that knows this intimately. Her body has been the site of the shrinking, the place where the contraction happened first, before the words, before the thought, before the decision. Her shoulders have learned a particular posture of apology, a rounding inward that began as a response and became a resting state. Her voice has learned a register of smallness, careful, quiet, always listening for the room's permission before it commits to a full sentence. Her jaw holds the things she decided not to say. Her stomach holds the anxiety of perpetually monitoring whether she is taking up too much. This is not metaphor. The body genuinely encodes the experience of years of emotional patterning. And when we begin to look honestly at the work of healing, at what it actually means to stop shrinking, we have to include the body in that conversation. Because a woman can understand, intellectually, that she is allowed to take up space, and her body can still contract the moment someone raises their voice, still apologize before the mind has even registered that an apology is happening, still make herself narrow in rooms where her fullness is, in fact, entirely welcome. There is a kind of exhaustion that comes from living in a body that has been holding this for years. It is not always the exhaustion of obvious fatigue. Sometimes it is a deeper, more ambient tiredness, a tiredness of always being slightly on guard, of always monitoring the room, of always running the background calculation of how much of herself she can safely show. The body pays for this vigilance. It pays in the form of tension that never fully releases, in the form of a sleep that never goes quite deep enough, in the form of an immune system quietly worn down by the chronic low-level stress of never fully arriving anywhere. There is also something that lives in the body that is harder to name, a longing. Not just for rest, though rest is part of it, but a longing for the experience of being fully present in herself, of not editing, not monitoring, not calibrating, of simply existing at full volume in a body that feels safe to inhabit completely. This longing is not weakness. It is not neediness. It is the body's own intelligence, speaking plainly about what it requires in order to be well. To hear that longing, to not immediately dismiss it or explain it away, is already a form of unchaining, because it means that something in her is beginning to insist on itself, and that insistence, however quiet, is the beginning of everything. Let us now sit with what that beginning actually looks like. Chapter 5. The first quiet acts of unchaining. There is a way that healing is imagined in our culture. In the stories we tell about it as a dramatic rupture, a moment of clarity, a decision made on a particular afternoon that changes everything. And sometimes it does look like that. Sometimes there is a moment, a conversation, a realization that breaks the pattern open and makes the old way of living simply impossible to return to. But more often, the unchaining does not look like that at all. It looks like something much smaller and much more private. It looks like the morning she decides not to apologize for the email she sent, even though every instinct in her reaches for the apology. It looks like the lunch where a friend talks about herself for 40 minutes, and she notices the imbalance for the first time, not with anger, but with a quiet, clear-eyed recognition. This is not equal. It looks like the moment she says, carefully, what she actually thinks, not the softened, pre-approved version, but the actual thought, and waits for the sky to fall, and the sky does not fall. These moments do not feel like healing when they happen. They feel small. They feel almost embarrassingly insufficient for the scale of what needs to change. But this is the nature of the unchaining. It happens at the cellular level before it happens at the level of the life. It happens inside before it rearranges the outside. And it requires, above all else, a quality of patience with herself that the woman who was taught to be small may find extraordinarily difficult, because she was also, inevitably, taught to demand nothing of others and everything of herself. One of the most consistent experiences of this beginning is the discovery that asserting herself, even in the smallest, most tentative way, does not produce the catastrophe she anticipated. The world does not end when she says no. The relationship does not shatter when she expresses a need. The person across from her does not disappear when she takes up a little more room. And each time this happens, something recalibrates, slightly and permanently, in her understanding of what is actually possible. There is also something important that happens in this phase with the internal voice, the one that has been providing commentary on her worth and her limits for as long as she can remember. This voice does not disappear when healing begins. It continues for a long time to offer its familiar assessments. You are too much. You are asking too much. You should apologize. You should be grateful for what you have. But something begins to change in her relationship to that voice. She begins, slowly, to hear it as a voice, not as the truth. She begins to notice that it has an origin, that it speaks in a register she has heard before, that it is not the voice of reality, but the voice of an old and frightened adaptation. This is not the same as silencing the voice. It is something more subtle and more durable than that. It is the beginning of a relationship with herself in which she is no longer entirely under the voice's authority, in which she can hear it, acknowledge its fear, and choose, in the small and private theater of her own interior, to proceed anyway. This is what unchaining looks like at the beginning. Not freedom yet, but the first unmistakable loosening of the chain. And speaking of this ongoing journey, if you are finding something true in these words, I want you to know that Unchained Heart has many other audiobooks that live in this same healing universe, exploring everything from recovering your sense of self after a difficult relationship, to understanding the patterns of the highly sensitive person, to the tender work of meeting your inner child. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so that none of them reach you too late. Chapter 6. The quality of life when you begin to take up space, there is no arrival. This is one of the truths that those who have walked this path long enough will tell you. If they are being honest, there is no morning you wake up and discover that the habit of smallness has completely left you. That you now exist in permanent confidence and unguarded fullness. That the work is finished and the rest is simply living. That morning does not exist. What does exist is something quieter and more sustaining than arrival. It is a quality of life that begins to change at the edges, and then gradually at the center. A quality that is less about what she has achieved and more about what she has stopped doing, what she has stopped apologizing for, what she has stopped explaining, what she has stopped trimming away in order to fit through doors that were, in fact, always wide enough. Consider what it feels like to be in a conversation and realize, partway through, that you have been speaking without monitoring, that you offered an opinion without preceding it with a disclaimer, that you expressed a feeling without immediately softening it with a reassurance that you are fine. It is fine. Please do not worry about it. This is not a dramatic experience. It is, in fact, so quiet that it can pass unnoticed. But something in the body marks it. Something settles. There is a faint but unmistakable sense of having been present, fully, without the usual tax of self-editing. Consider what it begins to feel like in relationships when she starts to allow her actual preferences to exist. When she orders what she actually wants, rather than what seems least inconvenient. When she says, I would rather not instead of sure, of course. When she allows herself to be difficult, not in the sense of being cruel, but in the sense of having an interior life that does not always align with what is easiest for everyone else. This is not selfishness. This is personhood. And it changes the quality of every relationship it touches, because when she stops performing the disappearing act, the people who remain are the ones who actually want her, not the curated, contracted version she had learned to offer. There is also something that happens with time itself. The woman who spent years organizing her inner life around the management of others' emotions discovers, as she begins to take up more of her own space, that there is more time. Not literally, the hours do not change, but experientially. Because so much of what consumed her was the invisible labor of monitoring, calibrating, anticipating, appeasing. As that labor gradually diminishes, as she slowly stops doing work that was never hers to do, There is something that opens up in the interior landscape. A new kind of quiet. A new kind of capacity. Room for her own thoughts, her own desires, her own particular way of seeing the world, which turns out to be something worth making room for. The deepest change is one that is almost impossible to describe until it is lived, a shift in the fundamental feeling of existing. The woman who has shrunk herself for years inhabits her life differently when she begins to stop. There is a quality to her presence, not louder, not bolder in any external sense, but more real, more fully herself. The kind of presence that makes a room feel different when she enters it, not because she is performing confidence, but because she is simply, finally, there. This is what the Unchaining ultimately offers. Not a new self, but a return to the self that was always there, underneath the apologies, underneath the contractions, underneath the years of careful management. The self that was never too much. The self that always deserved to be here, entirely, without explanation. Throughout these chapters, we have sat with the full arc of the life shaped by smallness, from the original soil where that smallness was planted, through the identity it built and the relationships it found, through the body that held it all without complaint, and into the first tentative and then more certain acts of unchaining. We have not offered a cure. We have offered something we believe is more durable than a cure, a clear and compassionate understanding of how this happened, and what becomes possible when a woman begins to see it honestly. What does this mean for where you are right now? Perhaps you are at the very beginning, only just recognizing the pattern, still inside it, with no clear sense of how to move through it. If so, let this be enough for today. You have named something. You have seen something that was always there but never fully looked at. That is not a small thing. That is, in many ways, the most important thing. Perhaps you are somewhere in the middle, already in the process of the unchaining, already taking those small and private and courageous first steps, and yet still finding the old habit insistent, still hearing the voice that tells you that you are too much. If so, hear this. The fact that the habit persists does not mean that the healing is not happening. It means that you are doing something genuinely difficult. It means that you are asking yourself to renegotiate a fundamental belief about your own worth, and that is not fast work. But it is the most important work there is. And perhaps you are further along, looking back at the years of smallness from a place of new and fragile spaciousness, still tender, still learning what it means to occupy your own life fully. If so, what you have done is extraordinary. Not because it looks dramatic from the outside, but because you did it quietly, privately, often without anyone to witness it. And you did it anyway. You have carried this long enough. You are not too much. You were never too much. You were only ever in rooms that were too small for what you were. And the work, the patient, unglamorous, transformative work of finding rooms that can hold you fully, that work belongs entirely to you, and you are not carrying it alone anymore. End of the audiobook.